In this video, I will show you some amazing chess traps that you can use to trick your opponents and win one game easily. So let's move on to our first trap. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, you play c3, black goes knight f6, you play d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, and then bishop b4 check is the most common move. You play knight c3, black goes knight takes e4, putting more pressure on this knight. You just castle here, and after knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, black goes bishop takes c3. Then you play bishop to e3, preventing black from castling. Taking this rook is a bad move because it loses to rook to e1 check. But here he plays d6, blocking your bishop and enabling bishop takes a1. But you play rook c1, hitting this bishop. Now bishop moves back, and then you go queen to a4, pinning this knight and also attacking this bishop. And the threat is d5. Here the best move for black is to play bishop to d7, and after d5, knight moves. Black have to give up his bishop. But here, castling seems like a natural move because it unpins your knight. But then you can just play d5, and after bishop d7, you can just take this knight, and after bishop takes c6, you can take the bishop as well, and you are just completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, black accepts the gambit and you play e4, trying to regain this pawn. Black goes e6, opening up his bishop. You play bishop takes c4, developing the bishop. He goes c5, striking in the center. You play d5, e takes d5, bishop takes d5, and here black goes knight f6, developing his knight. The best move for black was queen to b6, but no one is going to play that. Then you play bishop takes f7 check, sacrificing the bishop. If king takes, then you can just take his queen and you are just completely winning. But here, if he goes king to e7, then you can just exchange the queens, and after something like knight c3, you can develop all your pieces quickly and you're having a huge advantage. You're also up a pawn, so this will be a good game for you. The engine is giving a +3 advantage for white. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, d takes c4, you play e4, black goes c5, striking in the center. This is the best move for black. You play d5, black goes e6, offering an exchange of pawns. Don't take, otherwise black will exchange queens. Just play knight c3, e takes d5, then you recapture this pawn, knight f6, offering a trade of knights. Here, you can also play knight takes f6, which is not bad, but you can just play bishop takes c4, and here black thinks that he is winning a pawn after knight takes e4, but this is a big blunder because you can just play queen to e2, and after f5, thinking that his knight is defended, you can just play f3, and this knight is lost. Even though he tries b5, you can just take this pawn, and after bishop d7, you can just take the knight because this bishop is defended by the queen. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, knight f6, c4, you play e5. This is the Budapest gambit. D takes e5, you play knight e4, centralizing your knight. He goes knight f3, natural move. You play d6, offering an exchange of pawns. E takes d6, and then you recapture this pawn with the bishop. And here, white goes c3, with the idea of fianchettoing his bishop. But here, you are going to shock your opponent with knight takes f2, forking the queen and the rook. Now, king is forced to take, otherwise he will lose material, but then you can just play bishop takes c3 check, forcing the king to move away from the queen, and then you can just take the queen and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, black goes bishop to b4. You play bishop d3. Knight f6 is a common move. You play e5, knight of d7, and then you develop the other knight. Black castle here thinking that everything is just fine. But here, you're going to shock your opponent with this green gift. Bishop takes h7 check. Now king takes, and then you play knight g5 check. Queen cannot take because this knight is defended by the bishop, so king g8. And then you play queen to h5, threatening mate in 1. f6 is not a good move because queen to h7 will be mate, so he goes rook e8, creating an escape square for the king. But here, you are going to play queen takes f7 check first, so he is forced to move to the h8 square, and after queen h5 check, king g8. Now you play queen h7 check, king f8, then you play queen h8 check, king e7, and then queen takes c7 is a checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, d takes c4, e3, trying to regain this pawn, black plays b5. And here you go e4. This is the best move for white. And here, instead of playing c6 or a6, black goes bishop to d7, defending this pawn with the bishop. Now what you are going to do? Here, you are going to play a takes b5. Black goes bishop takes b5. Then you just develop the knight with tempo, hitting this bishop. He goes bishop a6, thinking that that bishop is defended by the knight. But here you are going to play queen f3, hitting this rook. Now c6 seems like a natural response by black, but as you can see, this knight is overloaded, so you can play this crazy tactical shot, rook takes a6. And after knight takes a6, you go queen takes c6 check, queen d7, then queen takes a8 check, queen d8 only move, then queen c6 check, and after queen d7, you can just take this knight and you are just completely winning in 12 moves. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, you play e6, he goes knight c3, and then you play c5. This is the Tarrasch defense. White goes bishop to f4, then you play c takes d4, hitting this knight. White plays an intermezzo with bishop takes b8, taking your knight. And then you can take his knight and he moves the bishop away. And after c takes b2, he goes bishop takes b2. Every move seems like normal, but this was a big blunder because you can play bishop to b4 check, and now he is forced to block with the queen, and you can just take this queen and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e6, d4, d5, you play knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4. Here, black goes bishop d7. You play knight f3, developing the knight. King goes bishop c6, hitting the knight. You just play bishop to d3, defending the knight. He goes knight f6, putting more pressure on this knight. You just exchange knight. Here, the best move for black is to play pawn takes f6. But here, he don't want to damage his pawn structure, so he recapture this knight with the queen. But then bishop to g5 completely traps the queen. Even though he tries bishop takes f3, counter-attacking your queen, you can just play queen to d2, defending this bishop. And after queen takes d4, you just play bishop to b5, which is a discovered attack on the queen. And after something like c6, you can just take this queen and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, knight f6, c4, you play e5, d takes e5, and then you play knight e4, centralizing your knight. Here, thousands of players have also played the move f3, which loses immediately because it weakens the diagonal along the king side. You can punish this move by first playing bishop to b4 check. Here, if he blocks with the knight, then you can just play queen h4 check, g3. Then you can just take this pawn with the knight, and after pawn takes, don't take the rook. Instead, play queen takes g3 checkmate. And here, if he blocks with the bishop, you play the same move, queen h4 check, g3, knight takes g3, pawn takes g3, and then don't take the rook, play queen takes c3 checkmate. Let's move on to our next step. After e4, knight f6, e5, you play knight d5, d4. White is grabbing the center, you play d6, attacking the center. He goes knight f3, you play d takes e5, he goes knight takes e5, centralizing his knight. Then you play c6, defending this knight. White goes c4, attacking your knight. You play knight b4. He goes a3, attacking your knight even further. But here, you're going to shock him with queen takes d4. First, if he takes your knight, then you will take his knight with chip, and black is quite okay. So he goes queen takes d4. But then, you play knight to c2 check, forking the king and the queen. And after king d1, you can just take this queen, and you are just up a pawn and completely winning. Let's move on to our next step. After e4, c5, here white goes d4. This is the Smith-Morgan gambit. You play c takes d4. He offers another pawn. You take this as well. Knight takes c3. Then you play e6. He goes knight f3. You play bishop to b4, pinning this knight to the king. He goes bishop c4, developing his bishop and preparing to castle. You play queen c7, hitting this bishop. Queen e2, defends the bishop. Then you play b5, attacking this bishop. So he goes bishop takes b5. Then you play bishop takes c3 check. And after b takes c3, you can play queen takes c3, forking the king and the rook. And after something like queen d2, you can just take this rook and you're completely winning. Let's move on to our next step. After c4, this is the English opening. You play e5. He goes d3. You play d5, offering white to take this pawn. He goes ahead and takes this pawn. You play queen takes d5, knight f3. Then you play bishop c5, developing the bishop. He goes c3 with the idea of shadowing this bishop. You play e4, attacking this knight. He goes d takes e4. And here, don't take this queen. Instead, play bishop takes f2 check, forcing this king to move away, and then you can just take this queen for free and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next step. After c4, e5, d3, d5, here white goes knight f3, you play bishop c5, he goes c3 with the same idea of shadowing his bishop. You go e4, and here instead of taking this pawn, he goes knight fd2, saving his knight. You play e3, which is a discovered attack on the rook and also hits the knight at the same time. Here, knight f3 seems like a natural move because it prevents you from capturing the rook. But then you can play e takes f2 check, and after king d2, this position for black is quite advantageous because he have a passed pawn and white's king also cannot castle. And you are just 2 moves away from castling. You can bring all your pieces out to launch an attack on this king and you are completely winning. The engine gives a -3 advantage for black. Let's move on to our next step. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, you play knight f6. Here white goes knight g5 with the fried liver attack. You play d5, e takes d5, then you play this tricky knight to d4, centralizing your knight. He goes d6, re-enabling this threat of f7. You play queen takes d6, and here white goes knight takes f7, forking your queen and the rook. but this is a big blunder because you can play queen to c6, hitting the g2 pawn and also hitting this bishop. He goes knight takes h8, taking the rook. You play queen takes g2, hitting this rook. He goes rook f1. Then you play queen e4 check. He cannot block with the queen, so he goes bishop e2, but then knight f3 is a checkmate. Let's move on to our last trap. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, he goes knight takes e5, you play knight c6. This is the Stafford gambit. He goes knight takes c6, you play d takes c6, he goes t3, defending this pawn. You play bishop c5, and here he goes bishop to g5, pinning your knight to the queen, but you are going to shock him with knight takes e4, sacrificing your queen. If he doesn't take the queen, then you can just save your knight and the position is quite better for black. But the most common move here is bishop takes d8. But then you can play bishop takes f2 check, king e2, and then bishop to g4 is a checkmate. Well, this is not the end. If you want to learn some more chess traps like these, then you can check out this left playlist. And if you want to learn some chess openings, then you can check out this right playlist. And if you don't want to miss more amazing videos like these, then don't forget to subscribe.